Tonight, we follow a trail so ancient that it existed long before the Crusades and so dangerous that powerful hands have protected it for over a millennium. It is a bloodline buried beneath myths, rumored to descend from rulers believed to be touched by something divine, hidden in marriages, symbols, forgotten manuscripts, and stories that the world was never supposed to piece together. Before the Knights Templar ever carved their place in history, another force existed, not an order built by walls or titles, but one held together by lineage itself. An ancient dynasty known as the Meravenians, a ruling family from a vanished age who claimed a sacred, untouchable authority, a right to lead that could neither be earned nor stolen, only inherited. Their downfall was written into the history books, but written history can also be rewritten. What if their bloodline didn't vanish? What if it survived quietly, slipping through the cracks of time, reshaping nations, influencing revolutions, and outliving entire empires? This story isn't just about crowns or kingdoms. It's about a lineage that may still exist in our world today, its presence invisible, its legacy locked away in places even the Vatican refuses to open. So before dismissing this as just another medieval legend, ask yourself, what if the greatest power in human history doesn't hide behind the shadows? What if it is the shadows? Like the video, subscribe, because tonight we open the seal on what I call the Merovingian code. And some bloodlines never die. What if I told you that the history you studied in school was only a carefully polished version of the truth? What if the stories about the Knights Templar guarding the world's deepest secrets were just part 2 of a narrative that began centuries earlier? Imagine tugging at a loose thread in the fabric of history and realizing that it stretches back long before the Templars rode beneath their white mantles marked by the Red Cross. Imagine stumbling upon a hidden pattern, symbols scattered through time, all pointing to a bloodline so influential that kings, popes, and entire empires, we've either protected it or hunted it. This isn't a fairy tale. It's a shadow that lingers behind the official textbooks, whispering across centuries. Close your eyes for a moment and recall the Middle Ages the way you've always pictured them. Clashing swords, stone fortresses, crusading knights marching into holy wars. These are the images burned into our collective memory. But behind that noise in dimly lit cloisters, secret councils, and royal chambers, another war was being fought. A silent conflict over a secret so powerful it could alter the foundation of Western civilization itself. And the truth doesn't begin with the Templars in the 1100s, it begins far earlier. In the mist-covered lands of the 5th century, Europe shattered after the fall of Rome, a continent broken into tribes and fragile kingdoms where survival itself was uncertain. Yet from this chaos, one dynasty rose with a claim unlike any other. They declared that their right to rule came not from conquest, not from political inheritance, but from their blood, sacred blood, blood tied to forgotten legends, guarded by monks, whispered by priests, and quietly feared by the most powerful throne in Christendom. These were the Meravenians to most people today. The name sounds like just another dusty reference in some medieval history book, but their true story is one of coats, assassinations, symbols older than Christianity, and a legacy almost erased from memory. They were kings who never cut their hair, believing it held divine strength. They bore golden bees as their emblem, symbolizing rebirth and immortality. And they lived under the unblinking watch of the church, a church that both blessed them and feared them. But if their legacy is so important, why is their story missing from the history you were taught? Asterisk, why? Is it that we know endless details about the Knights Templar, yet almost nothing about the kings who existed centuries before them? The answer isn't in what we've been told, it lies in the archives that have stayed sealed for lifetimes. Somewhere, perhaps in the deepest chambers of the Vatican, there may still be scrolls, private chronicles, and forbidden manuscripts that reveal the missing link between the forgotten Merovingian bloodline and the rise of the Templar order. The question isn't whether the Merovingians existed, we know they did. The real mystery is what they guarded, and why someone worked so hard to erase their name from memory. As we follow this path, you may start to wonder whether the biggest secret of the Middle Ages was never about the Templars at all, but about the rulers who came long before them. The year is 476. Rome does not collapse with a roar. It fades. Its marble columns crumble one by one. Roads that once stretched across continents crack and rot. Aqueducts that carried water for centuries now echo with emptiness. The systems that held an empire together, laws, trade, protection, all dissolve into dust. Europe becomes a fractured and unstable world. Kings rise and fall in the space of months. Tribes fight over tiny scraps of territory. Borderlines shift so often that maps become useless. This is not the romantic Middle Ages with polished armor and stained glass cathedrals. This is the true Dark Age, and the name couldn't be more accurate. Imagine it, dense forests swallowing the ruins of Roman villas, small settlements clinging to muddy riverbanks, their people constantly afraid of raids and starvation, whispers of old pagan gods drifting through cold night air, mixing uneasily with the growing influence of Christianity. There is no emperor, no unified authority. Power lies in the hands of whoever can seize it: warlords, bishops, tribal chiefs, and ambitious families. Yet even in this darkness, something is growing. Not crops, but ideas, alliances, networks, bloodlines. The church gathers strength, using belief as a blade sharper than any spear. But in the shadows, certain families rise as well, families whose influence spreads through strategic marriages, quiet treaties, and the loyalty of warriors who believe in them. People live on the brink of disaster. A single ruined harvest can doom an entire village. A small group of raiders can wipe out generations in one night. And amid this fragile world, stories emerge. Stories of leaders who seem different, touched by something beyond human understanding. Leaders whose power is rooted not only in land or armies, but in the belief that their blood carries a sacred destiny. In the lands we call France and Belgium today, the Franks begin their rise. Ferocious in battle, clever in diplomacy, they slowly unite scattered tribes under one banner. But within this rising Frankish world is something truly unusual, a dynasty unlike any other, the Meravenians. At first they appear to be just another warrior clan, but their reputation spreads quickly, and as their victories grow, so does the eerie aura surrounding their origins. This period, this vacuum of power, is the perfect breeding ground for secrets. With no strong empire to preserve records, history becomes whatever the record keepers decide to write. Monks choose what to record and what to erase. Powerful men choose which truths to hide and which to invent. The dark ages do not only describe violence or fear, it describes ignorance. It describes knowledge that was lost, rewritten, or buried on purpose. And somewhere in this fog-covered Europe, the first threads of a hidden, forbidden narrative begin to weave themselves into history, the beginning of the Meravenian mystery. If you follow these hidden threads long enough, they eventually lead to the doorstep of a dynasty that would one day entrust its most guarded secrets to the very order we now call the Knights Templar. In the heart of former Roman territory, a new force slowly takes form. The Franks, fierce northern warriors hardened by centuries of conflict, are carving their presence into the shattered landscape of the early Middle Ages. From within their ranks rises a bloodline unlike any in Europe. The Meravenians, spoken of with equal parts admiration and unease. Their strength is not merely numbers, nor is it exceptional military brilliance. Their authority rests on a belief that their blood is not only royal but sacred. Their legend begins with a figure named Mevic, a man whose origins are wrapped in the fog of myth. According to old tales, his mother, already pregnant by a Frankish ruler, was visited in the sea by a mysterious creature known as the Quinta, part human, part beast. This being was said to merge its essence with her. The child born from this strange encounter became the ancestor of the Meravenian line. To the church, this tale bordered on heresy. To ordinary people, it was evidence of divine favor. From their earliest days, the Meravenians were distinct. Their kings became known as the long-haired rulers because they refused to cut their hair, believing their flowing locks held both their strength and their legitimacy. Losing their hair meant losing their throne. The long strands resting across their shoulders weren't a fashion statement, they were a living, breathing crown. Some whispered that their hair carried a spark of the divine, a physical link between the king and the unseen forces that guided his destiny. From the late 400s to the 700s, the Meravenians ruled expansively over territories that now form modern France, Belgium, and parts of Western Germany. They secured influence through strategic marriages, earned loyalty through gifts and protection, and moved with an unmistakable sense of destiny. Yet beneath their public identity, there was a layer of secrecy. Their symbols, bees, fleurs, and ancient geometric patterns appeared on banners and royal seals, yet few understood their true meaning. Monks documented their deeds carefully, always cautious. Any mention of their supposed divine ancestry could draw unwanted scrutiny from Rome. The church needed the stability the Meravenians brought, but also watched them closely, wary of any spiritual claims that might challenge papal authority. Still, the stories persisted. People believed the Meravenians descended from an ancient, possibly biblical lineage whispered about in private gatherings. These rumors didn't simply entertain the public, they fortified the dynasty. A soldier might hesitate to strike a man believed to possess holy blood. A rival might abandon a planned rebellion against someone thought to rule with heaven's approval. And so the Meravenian dynasty expanded, wrapped in layers of myth, reverence, and fear. But like every powerful house, the very thing that made them extraordinary also made them vulnerable. Their bloodline, sacred in the eyes of followers, became a target for those who wished to control it, expose it, or wipe it from existence. Inside the courts of Meravenian kings, golden crowns were merely symbols. True power did not rest in metal or jewels. It rested in something far more intimate, something that grew from the king's own body. Their hair, untouched by blades, undisturbed by combs, their long flowing hair became the physical embodiment of their right to rule. To a Meravenian king, hair wasn't decoration, it was authority, a living thread connecting him to divine power from the earliest days of their reign. The long-haired kings stood apart, their hair draped down their backs like a shimmering banner no warrior dared to touch. Legend warned that cutting a Meravenian king's hair was not merely an insult, it was the destruction of his kingship. A shorn king was no king at all. The belief in the sacred power of Meravenian hair was so deeply rooted that enemies often chose humiliation over execution. Capturing a Meravenian king didn't always mean killing him. Sometimes cutting his hair was considered a far crueler fate, a living death, a symbolic execution of his authority. The true origin of this custom has been swallowed by time, but faint mentions in old monastic writings hint that it may trace back to Mevic himself and the mysterious circumstances surrounding his birth. Many whispered that his uncut hair was the physical proof of his supernatural lineage, the mark that he carried something holy in his veins. Long before Christianity spread through those lands, hair in pagan traditions symbolized strength, life force, and a direct spiritual link to the gods. Even after the Meravenians accepted Christianity, this older belief clung tightly to their image. To the people, the hair wasn't just a symbol, it was identity. To the kings, it was destiny. They protected their hair the way monks guarded sacred relics. It was never cut, never altered, always displayed as a defining piece of their presence when a Meravenian king rode into battle. His long gleaming hair whipping in the wind became a signal of divine favor. It transformed into a banner of living flesh, a sight that ignited courage in his men and fear in his enemies. In the royal courts, it served as a quiet reminder to allies and rivals. This ruler's authority came from something far older and more powerful than political agreements. The church's stance toward this tradition was complicated. On one side, the Meravenians helped spread Christianity and brought stability to chaotic lands. On the other, the notion that a ruler's legitimacy came from his hair, from something outside the church's authority, posed a subtle challenge to papal power. Some church leaders attempted to reinterpret the practice, claiming the hair was a gift from God rather than a sign of independent divine right. But the people resisted this sanitized version. They held firmly to the ancient belief, passing it quietly from one generation to the next. In the end, the hair of a Meravenian king was never merely decoration. It was a language, a code, a symbol understood instinctively by every warrior, every peasant, every enemy, and every ally. To cut the king's hair was to cut the lineage itself. As long as the hair remained, so did the throne. Cut it and the kingdom itself could collapse into chaos. It was the simplest crown in recorded history, yet perhaps the most powerful symbol a ruler ever carried. The story of Dagobert I begins at a time when the Meravenian name was already spoken across Frankish lands with a mixture of awe, fear, and reverence. Born into a dynasty that claimed a sacred and almost mystical right to rule, Dagobert inherited not only the long royal hair of his ancestors but the entire weight of their legend. From childhood, he was marked as a king in waiting, watched by ambitious nobles, protected by loyal warriors, and silently evaluated by the ever-watchful church. His rise to power was not abrupt, but it was inevitable, building slowly and steadily like a tide that could not be pushed back. When Dagobert ascended the throne in the early 7th century, the Frankish kingdom was still a fragile mosaic of competing territories, each ruled by local leaders with their own loyalties and ambitions. He inherited a realm that was strong, yet dangerously unstable, one that could shatter at the slightest sign of weakness. Many believed that only a ruler who combined political intelligence with a sense of divine destiny could keep the kingdom from falling apart. Dagobert embodied that ideal perfectly. His presence demanded respect, his voice carried authority, and his flowing Meravenian hair reminded everyone that he was no ordinary monarch. He expanded his power not merely through force, but through diplomacy and strategy. He forged alliances with neighboring kingdoms, married into influential families, and positioned loyal supporters in critical posts across his realm. Under his rule, the royal court transformed into a hub of wealth and culture. Gold glimmered on ceremonial goblets, tapestries illustrated legendary battles, and ambassadors from far-off lands traveled great distances to pay tribute. Roads that had decayed since the fall of Rome were restored, markets flourished, and trade routes stretched further than they had in generations. Yet Dagobert's leadership was not measured only in wealth or infrastructure. He understood the power of image, of symbolism and tradition. He presented himself as both a warrior king and a guardian of the faith, attending church ceremonies with a solemnity that impressed the clergy, while still fiercely preserving the old Meravenian symbols that linked him to his people's ancestral past. That was a delicate balance, honoring the church's authority without ever allowing it to overshadow his own divine claim to rule. There were, of course, moments of tension and whispers of treachery. Rival factions lurked in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But Dagobert navigated these dangers with a mixture of charm, calculated diplomacy, and decisive force when necessary. He was a king who understood both the appearance of power and the reality of it. Whenever danger surfaced, Dagobert moved quickly, crushing unrest before it could take root, and whenever opportunity appeared, he seized it without hesitation, weaving each victory into the growing tapestry of his legacy. By the height of his reign, his reputation stretched far beyond Frankish borders. To his people, he embodied the Meravenian ideal, ruler chosen by blood, guarded by faith, and destined to lead. To his enemies, he was a name spoken with equal parts fear and respect. Medieval chronicles remember his rule as a golden age of Meravenian strength, a moment when their power seemed unstoppable. But history teaches that the brightest flames cast the longest shadows. In the quiet corners of monasteries, behind closed doors in noble courts, whispers lived that could never be recorded in official histories, whispers so dangerous that speaking them too loudly could shake the foundations of both throne and church. At the center of these forbidden tales was a belief far more radical than anything the church would ever allow, that the Meravenians were not simply a royal dynasty. They were heirs to a sacred bloodline that traced back to the Holy Land itself. This legend began with a figure known in medieval lore as the Fisher King. In Grail mythology, he was the wounded guardian of a mysterious treasure. Some believed the Grail was a chalice, others a stone. But in the hidden tradition surrounding the Meravenians, the Grail was not an object at all, it was a lineage. The true treasure was blood. According to these secret stories, the family line of the Fisher King descended directly from Jesus of Nazareth and Mary Magdalene. After the crucifixion, Mary was said to have fled Jerusalem, crossing the Mediterranean to southern France, carrying not only teachings but a child. From that child's line came a bloodline that eventually intertwined with the ruling houses of the Franks, giving rise to the Meravenian dynasty. To the church, such an idea would have been pure heresy, a threat to the divine image they had built around Jesus. But to those who believed the legend, it granted the Meravenians a spiritual authority far beyond earthly politics. They were not rulers by conquest alone. They were heirs to a holy family chosen by fate, not by ecclesiastical decree. Under this belief, symbols took on new meaning. The golden bees found in Childric's tomb were said to symbolize rebirth and eternal life. The long hair of Meravenian kings became a physical sign of their unbroken connection to a sacred origin. Even the fleur-de-lis, later the emblem of France, was interpreted by some as a hidden reference to the union of this divine bloodline with Europe's royal houses. Whether these stories were truth, legend, or a brilliant piece of political myth-making, they served their purpose. They set the Meravenians apart from every other royal family. No other ruler could claim such ancestry without risking destruction by the church. The Meravenians never openly declared it, but the symbols and whispers were enough to keep the idea alive for centuries. If the story were true, the Grail was never lost at all because it was never an artifact. It was a living secret, walking, breathing, and wearing a crown. And if the blood of the Fisher King flowed through Meravenian veins, then the history we know is only the surface of a far deeper and far more dangerous truth. In medieval Europe, marriage was never a romantic affair. It was a weapon, a treaty, a carefully calculated move that could shape the fate of kingdoms. For the Meravenians, it carried an additional layer of secrecy. Their marriages were not only political alliances, but subtle maneuvers meant to protect something older than any earthly throne. Their unions were not chosen at random. They connected themselves to families whose lands carried traces of ancient religious traditions, places where early Christianity mingled with older pagan rites. Other families they married into claimed descent from obscure figures tied to biblical lands. It was as though the Meravenians were building a hidden network designed not only to expand power, but to safeguard a sacred inheritance. Rumors spread that some of these marriages were arranged with the blessing of secret religious circles, groups that operated alongside the church, that remained outside its authority. These alliances ensured the bloodline survival even when political tides turned hostile. By weaving their heritage into numerous noble houses, the Meravenians could conceal their lineage beneath layers of aristocratic connections. One tale speaks of a marriage between a Meravenian ruler and a noblewoman, whose family guarded a small ancient chapel built over a sacred spring. The church saw only a territorial alliance, but those who knew the older legends believed the spring had been a place of worship long before Christianity, and that the marriage served to protect its hidden meaning. In other cases, their unions tied them to families from southern France, regions that, centuries later, would become strongholds of groups like the Cathars, who spoke of secret gospels and alternate Christian histories. These later movements may have been echoes of a much older belief system, suggesting that the Meravenians stood at the center of a hidden spiritual resistance long before the church deemed such ideas heretical. The beauty of these alliances was their invisibility. To the world, they were royal celebrations marked with feasts and processions. Behind the scenes, they were silent agreements, pacts that bound families not just to a king, but to an idea worth guarding at all costs. Whether every marriage was part of this hidden purpose or only a few, the result was undeniable. The Meravenian bloodline spread deep into Europe's aristocracy. Even if the dynasty fell, its lineage would live on. A king could lose his crown, his hair, even his throne, but if his blood flowed through dozens of noble houses, his legacy would endure. Then, in 1653, a discovery shook both scholars and seekers of hidden truths. In the town of Tournai, laborers uncovered a sealed tomb untouched for more than a millennium. Inside lay the remains of Childeric I, one of the earliest Meravenian kings. As the chamber opened, the air seemed heavy with age. The flicker of torchlight revealed weapons, jewels, and royal insignia buried beside the long-dead ruler. But one object eclipsed all others: 300 tiny golden bees. Each one was crafted with astonishing detail, wings open as if frozen mid-flight. No coins bore their image. No written records mentioned them. Their meaning was a mystery, and mysteries are rarely accidental in Meravenian history. Despite their disappearance from written records, the golden bees lay quietly in the tomb of a king whose dynasty was already woven into myth. The moment they were uncovered, one question echoed through every scholarly hall: why bees? To an untrained eye, they might appear as nothing more than elegant ornaments. But to anyone familiar with ancient symbolism, the bee has never been an ordinary creature. In Egypt, bees represented royalty and rebirth, a symbol that bridged the world of the living with the realm of the dead. In Greek myth, they were tied to prophecy and sacred wisdom, and in strands of early Christian and pre-Christian belief, the bee was seen as a divine messenger. So when hundreds of golden bees were found beside a Meravenian king, it suggested far more than decoration. It hinted at initiation, at membership in a hidden tradition, perhaps even a secret order. Some scholars believe the bee may have been a Meravenian emblem long before the fleur-de-lis rose to prominence in France. If true, it would mean their royal identity did not originate from later Catholic symbolism, but from something older, deeper, and possibly independent of the church entirely. The bees may have been a coded declaration of sacred ancestry, readable only to those initiated into their circle. The discovery made such an impact that centuries later, Napoleon adopted the bee as one of his imperial symbols. Whether he understood its older meaning or simply wanted to borrow ancient prestige, his choice linked his rule to the mysterious authority of the Meravenian, and with that, the bee gained yet another layer of symbolic power. The fate of the original golden bees only deepened the mystery. In the early 1800s, many of them were stolen from the royal treasury and never seen again. Some likely vanished into private collections. Others may have been melted down for gold. Their disappearance created a silence, almost as if someone wanted the trail to fade, the meaning to dissolve. Yet the mystery survives. Were the bees a sign of divine kingship, a symbol of belonging to a hidden brotherhood, or keys to an esoteric knowledge passed through a bloodline that claimed a destiny far beyond earthly crowns? Whatever the truth, the bees of Childeric still hum faintly through the corridors of history. Their wings seem to whisper secrets we are only beginning to notice. For the Meravenians, kingship was never simply political. It was sacred, an appointment shaped by fate as much as by lineage. To their people, a Meravenian king wasn't elevated by a council or a church. It was marked from birth. Their rituals made this unmistakable. Every public appearance carried a sense of destiny. Every decision seemed wrapped in spiritual significance. One central belief stood above the rest: the king's very body was holy. Not in the symbolic way later monarchs claimed divine right through papal approval, but in a much older, almost mystical sense tied to blood, ritual, an ancient inheritance. The Meravenians' belief in sacred kingship ran far deeper than any ordinary claim to power. Rooted in ancient pre-Christian traditions, it had been woven into the Christian faith as it spread across Frankish lands. The long hair of the king was perhaps the most visible symbol of this holiness, but there were others far subtler. Legends tell that Meravenian kings could heal the sick with a mere touch, a practice centuries later echoed by English monarchs. Chroniclers of the time claimed these rulers could ease fevers, relieve pain, or calm the suffering simply through the laying of hands. Whether these acts were miraculous or ritualistic, they reinforced the notion that a Meravenian king was something more than human. Their coronation ceremonies reflected this otherworldly authority. Unlike the later medieval courts, heavy with jewels and gold, Meravenian kings were anointed with sacred oils, a tradition said to trace back to the biblical anointing of King David. This ritual did more than bless a new ruler. It linked him to a lineage of holy kings, reinforcing the idea that his authority derived from divine favor rather than mere earthly conquest. Symbols reinforced their sacred status. The golden bees, the earliest forms of the fleur-de-lis sun motifs in their art, each carried meaning beyond mere decoration. The bees, especially those found in Childeric's tomb, spoke of resurrection and eternal life. Colors worn by the kings were carefully chosen to reflect light, life, and divine alignment. Even the church, wary of claims to power outside its control, understood the utility a sacred king inspired loyalty, and loyalty to the king often meant loyalty to the faith. Yet, tension simmered beneath the surface. If a ruler's authority flowed directly from divine blood or sacred heritage, the Pope's blessing became less critical. This was why Meravenian kingship stood apart. It was governance intertwined with living ritual, a tangible embodiment of the union between mortal rule and heaven's will. To serve such a king was to serve more than a throne, it was to serve destiny itself. Legends whisper of a brotherhood operating in the shadows, a silent order that never sought thrones or banners but existed to protect a single bloodline across centuries. Their members could be merchants, scribes, minor nobles, or pilgrims, but bound by faith in the bloodline, they moved with patience, guarding it through assassination attempts, political intrigues, and shifting empires. Stories tell of Meravenian heirs smuggled from besieged fortresses, manuscripts hidden in abbeys encrypted in secret ciphers, and burial sites concealed to ensure no proof or leverage could ever threaten the bloodline. Their origins remain mysterious. Some link them to surviving druidic orders, others to secret societies that may have influenced the Knights Templar. Regardless, their mission endured across generations. The story darkens with the death of Dagobert II on a cold December day in 679, king of the eastern Frankish lands. He ruled with stubborn independence, refusing to bow completely to Rome. Official accounts claim a hunting accident near the Meuse River, struck by a spear, yet timing and circumstances suggest something far more deliberate. Rumors whispered he resisted puppet rule, preserved ancient traditions, and protected the sacred bloodline. His death was likely an attempt to sever a centuries-old chain. With Dagobert II's fall, the Meravenian dynasty entered its most perilous chapter. Thrones they once commanded with confidence were slipping into the hands of mayors of the palace, chief ministers who would eventually claim kingship for themselves. Open power faded, but the bloodline did not vanish. It went underground, hidden among the nobility, clergy, and merchants. Names changed, children were sent to remote monasteries, and loyal families safeguarded their secret. The surviving Meravenians moved unseen. Candlelit halls hosted secret oaths. Family crests hid coded symbols. Trade networks transmitted messages between scattered branches. Even the church, complicit in their decline, could not fully erase them. Members of the bloodline eventually entered service within the very institutions that had once sought their destruction, navigating power unseen, influencing from the shadows. Generations passed, and the line blurred into legend, but the bloodline endured. No longer tied to a single throne, it spread across Europe, adapting to survive. Silent, untraceable, yet ever present, a living secret that continues to outlast empires and evade history itself. While history books mark 679 as the end of Meravenian rule, the truth is far more subtle. That year did not close their story, it marked a turning point. The Meravenians did not vanish. They simply stepped out of the light, beginning a patient game that would stretch across centuries, quietly unfolding in the shadows across the old Frankish lands. Churches stand as silent witnesses. At first glance, they appear like any other medieval stone structure, weathered walls, narrow windows filtering pale light, worn altars where prayers have been whispered for generations. But for those who know where to look, these buildings speak a hidden language. Within their carvings, floor patterns, and stained glass lie clues to a secret too dangerous to voice aloud. Some of these churches date back to the height of Meravenian power. Their foundations were laid by kings and nobles loyal to the long-haired dynasty. Officially, they honored saints or commemorated victories blessed by the church. Unofficially, there were silent archives of symbols understood by only a select few. If the Meravenian bloodline truly carried a sacred heritage, these structures may have been guardians of that truth. Coded in stone, carvings are the first layer of the puzzle. Among crosses and biblical scenes, strange figures and patterns appear. Bees etched in unexpected places, geometric spirals, interlocking circles, star-like shapes that predate Christian symbolism. Scholars suggest some designs drew on pagan traditions tied to fertility, cosmic order, and life cycles. These symbols were the Meravenian signature, preserved where no one would dare erase them. In certain chapels, sunlight falls in precise alignments on specific days, illuminating altars or carvings in ways that cannot be accidental. These dates often correspond to both Christian and pre-Christian calendars, hinting at a dual message, one for the devout, another for the initiated. Some figures in the art resemble biblical characters, but with subtle differences, robes of unusual colors, objects not mentioned in scripture, facial features reminiscent of known Meravenian rulers, portraits hidden in plain sight, carved into holy scenes. The symbolism was enduring. While kings could be dethroned and records erased, church walls stood for centuries, quietly carrying messages forward. The Meravenians understood that even if their reign ended, as long as their symbols endured, the story of their bloodline could never be silenced. Long before it became the ultimate emblem of French monarchy, the fleur-de-lis belonged to something older, more secretive. Tracing its delicate petals through time from the Capetians, the Valois, and even the Carolingians leads directly to the Meravenian. For them, it was not decoration but a statement. Authority rooted not in the Pope or the sword, but in a lineage stretching into the shadows of ancient history. Some historians link the fleur-de-lis to the golden bees found in Childric's tomb. The stylized petals mirror the shape of a bee, both symbolizing life, continuity, and resurrection, the essence of Meravenian kingship. Others trace it further back, to the Egyptian lotus, a sign of rebirth and divine authority, hinting that the bloodline's origins may have reached beyond Europe to the ancient Near East coins. signet rings, and architectural motifs from the Meravenian era bear early forms of the fleur-de-lis. Its consistent use suggests it was more than ornamentation, it was a brand of sovereignty. The Church did not oppose the symbol openly, perhaps because it could be reinterpreted through Christian imagery. But among the faithful to the old ways, the fleur-de-lis carried a hidden meaning, linking the Meravenians to rulers whose authority stemmed from sacred blood rather than papal sanction. Centuries later, when the Capetians adopted it, they may have been consciously claiming the lingering prestige of a dynasty, once seen as chosen by forces greater than mortal law. Every shield, banner, or crown bearing the fleur-de-lis may have echoed this ancient and sacred legacy. It was never just French, it was eternal. And then there are the Gospels, the ones everyone knows, read aloud in churches, and bound in countless Bibles. And then there are the Gospels that never reach the pulpit. Texts whispered in monastic corridors or hidden in vaults, seen by only a select few. The Meravenian bloodline was bound not just to crowns or territories, but to secrets the world has only begun to glimpse. These are the so-called secret Gospels, texts whispered about in the corridors of monasteries and hidden archives, and some believe they hold the key to understanding why the Meravenian bloodline was once considered sacred. Their existence is not mere fantasy. Across dusty caves, buried jars, and forgotten libraries, archaeologists have unearthed writings from the earliest days of Christianity, documents that tell a story at once familiar and startlingly different. Some recount alternate versions of Jesus' life, while others speak of travels, teachings, and relationships never mentioned in the official scriptures. The most provocative suggest a partnership between Jesus and Mary Magdalene far deeper than mere friendship, hints of marriage, of a shared mission. If these accounts are true, they could explain how a sacred bloodline might have arisen, passed down through generations, hidden from the world. It is easy to see why the Church would want such writings concealed. They would shift the locus of divine authority away from the institution itself, placing it instead in the hands of a family, a lineage capable of claiming divine power without papal sanction. For the Meravenians, descendants of this line, the survival of such Gospels would have been both a gift and a peril, proof of sacred heritage, yet a threat to powerful institutions. Stories persist of manuscripts quietly moved from monastery to monastery, encoded to appear harmless to outsiders. In southern France, a region steeped in legends of Mary Magdalene, certain abbeys are said to have housed these texts for centuries. Monks guarding them never admitted their existence, yet gaps in ancient inventories hint at missing volumes, works recorded, catalogued, then vanished. Some believe fragments survived within other manuscripts, a verse subtly altered here, a parable reworded there, enough to conceal the original intent while preserving its truth for those who knew where to look. Others speculate that complete copies remain locked in the Vatican's private archives, sealed away to prevent the story from overturning the official narrative of Christianity. For those tracing the Meravenian legacy, the potential discovery of these Gospels is electrifying. They would be more than historical curiosities, they would be proof that the bloodline was not a medieval invention, but a living continuation of a sacred story, stretching back to the 1st century. Whether these secret Gospels will ever be found is uncertain, but their shadow lingers in the hidden carvings of ancient churches, in symbols woven into sacred architecture, and in the quiet defiance of a dynasty that understood its origins were too important to leave in the hands of its enemies. After the fall of their open rule in the late 7th century, the Merovingians seemed to vanish from the political stage, yet for those who looked closely, the bloodline never truly disappeared. It endured, hidden in plain sight, flowing quietly through generations, carrying the secret of a lineage that may have been touched by the divine itself. After the fall of their throne, the Meravenian legacy did not vanish. It simply changed form, slipping into places where authority did not wear a crown. Two of the most unlikely sanctuaries were the quiet halls of monasteries and the bustling lanes of medieval trade. Monasteries were more than centers of prayer, they were hubs of knowledge, wealth, and influence. Built on lands donated by kings and nobles, their abbots often moved in the same political circles as rulers. Within these stone walls, under the careful watch of the Church, surviving allies of the Meravenians could hide heirs and preserve their history. A child of the bloodline might grow up under a new name, educated in reading, languages, and scripture, while quietly learning the stories, symbols, and secrets of their true heritage. To outsiders, they were devout servants of God. Inside the cloister, they were seeds waiting for the right season. Some abbeys became safe houses not just for people, but for manuscripts, family records, and relics tied to the Meravenian past. Scribes may have copied these records into other texts, disguising them within religious commentary to preserve them without raising suspicion. Through this careful work, the memory of the bloodline survived the slow erasure of official history. But monasteries were not the only lifeline. Beyond the cloister walls, the world of trade offered another layer of protection. Early medieval merchants traveled across regions carrying goods, news, and secrets. Allies of the bloodline became traders themselves, weaving networks through markets and ports, or partnering with guilds to act as couriers. passing information between distant branches of the family. Ships carried wool and wine, but they also carried letters sealed in wax, coins bearing symbols long out of use, and precious items passed hand to hand, leaving no trace in official records. In crowded markets, these messengers disappeared into the noise, invisible guardians of a secret legacy. By blending into these two worlds, the silent discipline of monasteries and the restless movement of trade, the Meravenian legacy endured. The dynasty had lost its throne, but not its story. In the quiet work of monks and the tireless journeys of merchants, that story continued its patient journey through history. Even the roads of medieval Europe, traveled by kings and armies, became arteries of protection. Pilgrims moved from the British Isles to the Holy Land, carrying little more than faith, a staff, and a pouch of provisions. To most, these were paths of devotion, but for the guardians of the Meravenian bloodline, they were a hidden network of communication. Nobles and beggars alike walked these roads, blending into a constant stream of travelers. Among them moved messengers disguised as humble pilgrims, carrying coded letters, whispered instructions, or small relics tied to the bloodline's claim. Certain routes were especially valuable. The Way of St. James de Santiago de Compostela drew travelers from across Europe, passing through regions with known Meravenian connections. The Via Francigena stretched from England through France into Italy, linking monasteries and towns loyal to the bloodline. Pilgrims could visit safe houses under the guise of devotion, exchange messages in crowded inns, or deliver instructions during prayer at chapels. The beauty of the pilgrim disguise was its fluidity. A traveler could join a group for days, then vanish into anonymity. Even rituals offered opportunities for coded communication. Marks in a pilgrim's record could signal messages only understood by the initiated. Folklore speaks of travelers arriving in a village just as a long-lost relative of a noble household appeared, sometimes marrying into trusted families, planting branches of the bloodline in new soil. By walking in plain sight, the guardians of the Meravenian legacy turned pilgrimage into something far more than a spiritual journey. It became a lifeline, a way to connect scattered allies, preserve the bloodline, and carry forward a story that could never be written openly. Asterisk, as the centuries rolled on, the roads themselves seemed to remember, holding the footprints of countless travelers, some seeking God, others carrying the quiet heartbeat of a hidden crown. Across the rolling countryside of Europe, abbeys appear, ordinary to the casual visitor, quiet stone sanctuaries where monks once moved in rhythm with the bells, tending gardens, chanting prayers. Yet for those who study the Meravenian mystery, some of these abbeys are more than holy places. They are coded structures, silent testaments to a bloodline that refused to vanish. Many of these abbeys trace back to the Meravenian era, built under the patronage of nobles loyal to the long-haired kings. These patrons commissioned subtle details that spoke only to the initiated. A carved lintel above a doorway might appear as a simple floral motif, but closer inspection reveals petals forming a fleur de lis, hinting at its older pre-French significance. Windows carried their own secrets. In some abbeys, the stained glass was arranged so that sunlight would fall on a specific carving only on certain days tied not to the church calendar, but to key moments in Meravenian history. A beam, striking an altar on the anniversary of Dagobert II's death, invisible to most, became a quiet reminder to those who remembered. Even the cloisters, a square courtyard surrounded by covered walkways, held secrets. Capitals on columns sometimes displayed animals or plants, rare in Christian iconography: bees, lotus flowers, intertwined serpents. Each motif carried layered meanings: resurrection, rebirth, wisdom, and ancient authority. Certain abbeys were deliberately aligned with pre-Christian sites, echoing the sacred geography of standing stones and pagan temples. By embedding these structures in older cosmic patterns, the builders tied the bloodline's heritage to powers far older than the church itself. Folklore clings to these sites. Locals whisper of sealed rooms beneath the floors, tunnels leading to forgotten chapels, and relics quietly removed during times of danger and never returned. In some tales, a monk entrusted with a secret left behind a carved mark, barely visible on a hidden wall, guiding future guardians to what mattered most. Today, these abbeys remain part of the official history of Christianity in Europe, their true layers hidden beneath centuries of worship, repair, and devotion. Yet for those who know where to look, every stone, every sunbeam, every carving may still whisper the secrets of a bloodline that time could not erase. Tourists walk the halls of these abbeys, photographing windows, admiring stonework, completely unaware that they might be standing inside a message built to last 1,000 years. For the Meravenian legacy, that was the genius of the design: to speak without words, to endure without being seen, and to let the stones themselves remember what others had tried to forget. This erasure did not happen with a single decree or dramatic trial. The downfall of the Meravenians was slow, careful, deliberate, like ink fading from a page until the words could no longer be read. After the death of Dagobert II in 679, the dynasty's open rule began to unravel. But what followed was not simply the natural decline of a family losing political power. According to some historians, it was the result of a quiet war waged by the church. A campaign fought not with swords, but with parchments, appointments, and the rewriting of history itself. The church understood that controlling the narrative was as vital as controlling the crown. If the Meravenians truly carried a sacred bloodline, their claim to rule did not depend on papal blessing. That made them dangerous. So instead of confronting them openly, the church diminished their importance in every possible way. Chroniclers and monastic scriptoria began focusing on the mayors of the palace, the administrators who would eventually replace kings entirely. In these accounts, Merovingian rulers became passive, weak, ceremonial figures, while their successors were portrayed as strong leaders, chosen by God. Records of the dynasty's achievements quietly disappeared. Victories in battle, laws passed, and alliances forged were left in obscurity, replaced by stories of laziness, vanity, or incompetence. Over time, the phrase "do-nothing kings" became attached to them, a label still lingering in modern history books. Art and symbols connected to the bloodline were also quietly repurposed. Bees, once proud emblems of the Merovingians, vanished from public use, replaced by crosses and fleurs-de-lis of later dynasties as symbols the church could control and reinterpret. Churches and abbeys founded by Merovingian patrons were rededicated to saints, more in line with papal authority. Original founders' names were sometimes erased from plaques and records. Even genealogies were blurred. Lineages that once connected them to ancient or biblical figures disappeared, replaced with carefully edited family trees supporting the legitimacy of new rulers. In this way, the Meravenians were not just dethroned, they were rewritten out of history. The brilliance of the strategy lay in its subtlety. There were no open wars, no martyrdom to inspire loyalty. Generation after generation grew up knowing only the version of history the church allowed. By the time the last whispers of their reign faded, most believed the Meravenians had been irrelevant long before they vanished. Yet the very need for such a methodical erasure suggests the opposite. They were far more significant than the official story admits. Perhaps that is why their name still stirs curiosity today. The golden bees of the Meravenians once shimmered as emblems of life, resurrection, and an unbroken line of kings. They adorned the tomb of Childai, glinting among treasures that spoke of both earthly power and something older, almost mystical. By the 12th century, with the rise of the Knights Templar, the bees were gone from public banners. In their place stood bold, unmistakable crosses, symbols of Christian faith, holy war, and authority sanctioned by the church. The journey from bees to crosses is more than a shift in style. It is the story of a bloodline's identity being reshaped, hidden beneath a new set of symbols. In the Meravenian world, bees were never just decorative. They tied the dynasty to ancient ideas of renewal, wisdom, and a connection to divine cycles. Some historians even suggest they were a continuation of pre-Christian emblems carried over from the Near East or Egypt, where the bee was sacred to kingship. Bees whisper, crosses declared, and when the Templars adopted the cross, it was both a practical choice and a political statement. The question is whether the change was a clean break or a quiet transformation. Some historians believe the Templars inherited more from the Meravenians than just land and influence. They were not merely warriors, they were administrators, bankers, and keepers of secrets, roles that would have appealed to a displaced bloodline determined to protect its legacy. If certain Merovingian traditions survived within the Templars, the bee may have gone underground, its meaning encoded into the crosses themselves. Some medieval crosses used by secretive orders contain subtle, almost hidden patterns, three-pointed forms, intersecting loops, or stylized petals echoing the curves of the fleur-de-lis or the spread of bee wings. Were these coincidences, natural artistic variation, or the fingerprints of a lineage leaving its mark where only the observant would notice? Color offers another clue. The Meravenians were associated with gold, the hue of their bees, while the Templars bore red crosses on white. In heraldic terms, gold and red both signify power, courage, and divine favor. Perhaps the shift was not erasure but disguise, a change of form, preserving the inner message while altering the outer appearance. By the time the Templars reached their peak, their cross had become one of the most recognized emblems in Europe. To the world, it symbolized loyalty to Christ and the mission to defend the Holy Land. But for those who follow hidden history, it may have carried another memory, a swarm of golden bees, alive in meaning but hidden beneath the arms of a cross. In this way, the transformation was not an ending, but a disguise. When Childeric I's tomb was opened in the 17th century, it revealed treasures that stunned scholars: swords, jewels, a golden signet ring, and most famously, hundreds of tiny golden bees, officially catalogued as royal ornaments and burial items. For some, they were pieces of a puzzle, fragments of a code that, if understood, could point to sanctuaries where the Meravenian bloodline persisted in secret. The bees alone numbered over 300, each carefully crafted, each identical yet subtly varied in placement. Some researchers believe the arrangement was deliberate, forming patterns corresponding to constellations or geographic locations. If true, the bees were not mere decoration, they were coordinates. The tomb itself became a map, disguised as a royal grave. The signet ring deepens the mystery, bearing an image likely of Childeric himself. Its unusual carving style hinted at influences from distant lands. Around its edge was a Latin inscription, formal yet abbreviated, as if concealing another message beneath the surface. Some theorize it was both a symbol of kingship and a literal key to a location tied to the bloodline's survival. Other objects from the tomb raise questions. A ceremonial sword etched with strange markings, horse gear inlaid with uncommon patterns, and even the grave's placement near the river close to older pre-Christian sacred sites. When first discovered, the treasures were sent to Vienna for safekeeping, but Fedor perhaps designed. In the late 18th century, most were stolen. Only a few remain in museums today, leaving us with fragments of a picture that can no longer be fully seen. Believers in the hidden map theory view this loss as suspicious. If the relics encoded locations of sanctuaries, abbeys, fortified estates, or even underground chambers, removing them would be the perfect way to keep that knowledge buried. Some suggest the thieves were not ordinary criminals but agents, securing the artifacts before their secrets could be deciphered. Without the full set, the map remains incomplete, but legends persist. Sketches and copies made before the theft are rumored to survive in private collections, waiting for someone who can read the code. A code that might lead not just to hidden treasure, but to the living descendants of a dynasty thought long gone by the mid-8th century. The Meravenians were kings in name only. Real power had shifted to the mayors of the palace, the administrators, who managed the kingdom while the monarchs remained ceremonial. Among these mayors, one family rose above the rest, the Carolingians. Through military skill, political cunning, and most importantly, the church's blessing, they would replace the ancient dynasty. The transition was gradual. The Carolingians had been consolidating influence for decades, beginning with figures like Charles Martel. His victory at the Battle of Tours in 732 made him a hero across Christendom. Technically serving under a Meravenian king, Charles became the true power in the Frankish realms. His military successes granted immense prestige, and the Church, seeing him as a defender of the faith, became a willing ally. The alliance between the Carolingians and the papacy was no accident. The Church had grown uneasy with the Meravenians, whose sacred kingship relied on bloodline and ancient tradition rather than papal approval. The Carolingians, by contrast, offered loyalty and protection in exchange for legitimacy, a bargain the popes could not refuse. The decisive moment came in 751, when Pope Zachary approved Pepin the Short, son of Charles Martel, as king. For the first time in Frankish history, a king was chosen not by hereditary right, but by papal sanction. Childeric III, the last Meravenian king, was deposed. His long hair was cut, a ritual as much as a political statement signifying the end of his right to rule. He was sent to a monastery, a symbol of both humiliation and containment. The sacred bloodline of the Meravenians could be set aside, if the Church willed it, with Pepin crowned and anointed. The Carolingians ascended as the new royal family, their authority visibly anchored in partnership with Rome. This bond only grew stronger in the next generation, when Pepin's son, Charlemagne, expanded the Frankish kingdom into an empire and was crowned emperor by Pope Leo III on Christmas Day in 800. The rise of the Carolingians marked more than a mere change of rulers. It was the end of an era where kings claimed divine authority through lineage, and the beginning of a model where the Church could grant or withhold the right to rule. For the Meravenians, this was not just political defeat, it was a rewriting of the rules themselves. Their name faded into shadows, replaced by a dynasty whose power was built upon a throne shared with the papacy. Yet, the abruptness of their removal raises a question that lingers to this day. Why was it so vital for the Church to erase the Meravenians? When a royal bloodline loses its throne, survival often depends on invisibility. For a family whose claim to rule was rooted in both sacred heritage and political authority, disappearing entirely was never an option. The line had to endure, even if it meant exchanging crowns for cloaks. According to persistent whispers in medieval history, some members of the bloodline entered the very institutions that had helped remove them. Monasteries, religious orders, cloisters, places where they could hide in plain sight. Monastic life in the Middle Ages was a world within a world. Behind stone walls, men and women dedicated themselves to prayer, study, and labor. To outsiders, they were humble servants of God, absorbed in scripture and discipline. Yet within those same walls, the cloister offered something rare: safety. The Church was unlikely to harm those who had taken vows, and the rhythm of monastic life provided the perfect cover for someone whose identity needed to remain hidden. There are accounts never officially confirmed of noble children disappearing from court life, only to reappear years later as monks or nuns in influential abbeys. In some cases, their family connections quietly secured them positions of authority, or prioritizing them to oversee lands, resources, and networks without the scrutiny that came with a royal title. In these roles, they could still maintain contact with loyal allies, pass on coded messages, and safeguard knowledge of their lineage for future generations. Some orders were particularly suited to this hidden existence. The Benedictines, with their devotion to scholarship, offered access to libraries where historical records and genealogies could be quietly preserved. The Cistercians, known for their remote abbeys, provided seclusion from the prying eyes of political intrigue. Even more secretive were the military orders that blended monastic vows with knightly duties, a perfect environment where one could be both warrior and guardian of something far greater than oneself. The robes themselves became a kind of armor. In a society that revered religious life, few would question the background of a devout monk or nun. A Meravenian descendant could live quietly, labor diligently, and outwardly obey the church while privately carrying a lineage that the institution had tried to erase. For those who believed in the sacred nature of their bloodline, the monastery was not a prison, but a sanctuary, a place where the line could endure until the time was right to Legends even speak of secret ceremonies held in candlelit cloisters, where vows were whispered not just to God, but to the family's enduring cause. In such moments, the habit and hood were not symbols of surrender, but of strategy. Whether these stories are fact or romanticized history is impossible to confirm. Records from the period are fragmentary, and monasteries rarely detailed the origins of their members. Yet the persistence of these rumors suggests one truth. The Meravenian bloodline did not vanish. It learned to walk unseen through the halls of power, cloaked in the quiet dignity of monastic robes, waiting for a day when its name could be spoken aloud once more. By the early 12th century, the Knights Templar emerged, officially as protectors of Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. Their origins were humble, a small group sworn to defend the faithful along dangerous roads. Yet within a few decades, they became one of the most powerful and mysterious organizations in medieval Europe. Their rise was so sudden, and their influence so great, that whispers spread of hidden alliances and secret inheritances. Among the most intriguing theories is that the Templars came into possession of Meravenian secrets, preserved across centuries until the time was right to use them. According to legend, the connection began during the First Crusade. As European armies carved out territories in the Levant, the Templars gained access to ancient sites, places layered with biblical, pagan, and dynastic histories. Some of these locations may have been tied to the very traditions the Meravenians were said to guard. In Jerusalem, the Templars established their headquarters on the Temple Mount, a site heavy with sacred meaning. Officially, it was a strategic location. Unofficially, rumors speak of excavations beneath the mount, tunnels leading to relics and documents hidden for centuries. If the Meravenian bloodline had indeed gone underground after the fall of their dynasty, it is possible that their guardians, living descendants or allied monastic orders, passed such treasures to a military order strong enough to protect them. The Templars, disciplined and fiercely loyal to their own, would have been the perfect stewards of a secret legacy. Symbols add fuel to this theory. Certain Templar seals, like the one showing two knights on a single horse, have been interpreted as representing duality, perhaps even to intertwined lineages or missions. The red cross they bore, already layered with meaning, may have carried faint echoes of older dynastic emblems. The Templars amassed extraordinary wealth and influence in remarkably short order, prompting some to believe they drew power not just from sword and strategy, but from knowledge more valuable than gold. By the mid-12th century, they operated not only as warriors but as bankers, diplomats, and keepers of secrets. They moved freely between kingdoms, communicating across vast distances with a speed and security unmatched in their time. This network mirrors, in many ways, the pilgrimage routes and connections said to have preserved the Meravenian legacy during centuries of concealment. Whether the Templars consciously protected the bloodline or merely inherited fragments of its heritage, their legend grew around the idea that they were guardians of something far greater than themselves. Even after their violent suppression in the 14th century, the whispers did not die. If anything, the mystery deepened, as if the Templars had succeeded in their most important mission, not in holding territory or defeating enemies, but in keeping a secret alive, one that may have begun with the long-haired kings of France. The image on the seal is simple at first glance: two knights sharing a single horse. It is the most famous emblem of the Knights Templar, stamped on official documents, worn as a sign of identity, and instantly recognizable across medieval Europe. Yet, like so many Templar symbols, simplicity hides complexity. The meaning of the two riders has been debated for centuries. Interpretations range from humble poverty to a cryptic nod toward a hidden lineage, perhaps even the Meravenians themselves. The official explanation in the Middle Ages was straightforward. When the Templars were first founded, they were so poor that two knights had to share one horse. The seal reflected their vows of poverty and commitment to brotherhood, a story that fit neatly into the image of a pious, self-sacrificing order dedicated to God. But the problem is that the Templars were not poor for long. Within a few decades, they had amassed wealth, land, and political influence. Why then would such a rich and powerful order continue to use a seal that suggested want and deprivation? This question opens the door to deeper theories. Some historians and alternative researchers suggest that the two riders symbolize duality, to missions, to identities, or even to bloodlines. The Templars may have operated in the open as defenders of Christendom while quietly safeguarding a separate, far more controversial cause. If the Merovingian bloodline had entrusted them with its survival, the seal could have been an encoded reminder, a single horse representing the shared path, two riders symbolizing two intertwined destinies, bound together in secrecy and purpose. Others have noted that the design of the seal carries an almost heraldic feel, with symmetry and balance that suggests deliberate symbolism rather than mere illustration. In medieval iconography, the horse often represented authority and legitimacy, while the rider embodied the power that wielded it. Two riders could imply shared sovereignty, an idea that aligns perfectly with legends of the Meravenian sacred kingship and the Templars' role as its secret protectors. Even the positioning of the figures invites speculation. In some versions of the seal, neither knight leads nor follows. They appear equal in stature. This could be a statement about equality between the Church's visible authority and the hidden bloodlines claimed to rule, or a warning that the Order's true allegiance was split between the two. The seal also resonates with imagery far beyond Europe. In Near Eastern and Byzantine art, paired figures often carried layered meanings, referencing divine twins, guardian pairs, or dual rulers. The Templars, exposed to many cultures during their time in the Holy Land, may have adapted these symbols for their own purposes. By keeping the meaning of their seal open to interpretation, the Templars ensured it could pass scrutiny without revealing its deeper significance. To most, it was an emblem of humility. To a select few, it may have been a quiet declaration of a pact forged long before the Crusades, a pact between warriors of the cross and the descendants of kings, riding together on a single path through history. The Templars' journey to the Holy Land was never only about defending pilgrims or holding territory. Officially, they were a military order sworn to protect Christian sites. But beneath the surface, there are hints of another mission, one that involved digging into the very heart of biblical history to find proof of a lineage said to be both royal and divine. This quest would have taken them from the courts of Europe to the deserts of the East and back, carrying secrets capable of rewriting Christianity itself. Their headquarters in Jerusalem was no ordinary lodging. Granted quarters on the Temple Mount, a location steeped in sacred meaning, the Templars occupied a site layered with history. From the Jewish Temple of Solomon to legends of hidden relics and lost knowledge, chroniclers mention that the order spent years making alterations beneath the mount. Some believe they searched for artifacts, scrolls, genealogies, or relics that could verify the survival of the bloodline connected to the Meravenians. Holy Land was full of whispers about treasures hidden by guardians of the lineage, documents perhaps detailing descendants of figures like Jesus and Mary Magdalene. If the Templars found such items, they kept them fiercely guarded. Their order was legendary for secrecy, and transporting dangerous knowledge was a skill they mastered like no one else. The expeditions were not limited to Jerusalem. Records suggest Templar activity extended to Galilee, Nazareth, and across the Jordan River regions. Steeped in early Christian and pre-Christian history, they may have followed trails laid by older guardians of the lineage, possibly connected to Eastern Christian sects or Jewish groups who preserved traditions outside the control of Rome. These journeys required alliances with local leaders, merchants, and scholars, granting access to archives and sacred spaces normally closed to outsiders. Returning to Europe, the Templars brought more than relics. They carried stories, architectural ideas, and symbols that began appearing in their churches and communes. Some designs were decorative to the untrained eye, yet for those in the know, there were coded references to the bloodline, a carved motif here, a stained glass arrangement there, a quiet reminder of the secrets they had uncovered in the East. If their mission truly included verifying a sacred lineage, their greatest achievement may have been preserving that knowledge without revealing it. Even after their destruction as a political force, what they uncovered did not vanish. Like the bloodline they may have protected, the truth traveled quietly from east to west, surviving in hidden archives, safeguarded by those who understood its significance and danger. Beneath the soaring spires and stained glass windows of Europe's cathedrals lie spaces the public never sees, down narrow staircases and behind locked iron gates. Vaults and chambers carved into the earth stretch into shadows, some older than the buildings above. Officially, they store relics, church records, and treasures. But whispers claim that some hide far more, archives containing proof of a sacred bloodline, kept under the watch of those who understand its power. These legends focus on cathedrals with long, curious histories, like Chartres, Reims, and Notre Dame in Paris, constructed with the support of kings, bishops, and powerful patrons. These buildings often took generations and were sometimes erected on sites already considered holy in pre-Christian times. Beneath their altars and crypts, the legends say, lie the real treasures. Shelves lined with manuscripts stretch into shadowy vaults. Locked chests sit beneath layers of dust, and parchments in Latin, Greek, or forgotten scripts hint at genealogies tracing a line from the Merovingian kings back through centuries, possibly even 2 New Testament figures. If these records exist, they would challenge the official history taught by the Church, explaining why they have never been made public. Tales also describe artifacts stored alongside the writings, small reliquaries containing personal items linked to the bloodline or ceremonial objects, marked with symbols like the golden bee or flower. Some items are said to have been brought from the Holy Land during the Crusades, smuggled back by the Templars, and entrusted to cathedral vaults for safekeeping. The keepers of these secrets, according to legend, are a small group within the church, bound by vows stronger than any written oath. Their role is not to destroy the materials, but to ensure they never fall into the wrong hands. Over centuries, these vaults have survived fires, wars, and revolutions, always protected, always resealed. For the ordinary visitor in a cathedral nave, the idea that such secrets lie just beneath their feet is almost unimaginable. Yet the whispers persist, passed from one generation to the next. If the archives are real, they are more than a collection of old papers. They are the memory of a bloodline, hidden in silence beneath stone, waiting for a moment when the world might finally be ready to hear its story. In the rolling hills and rugged mountains of southern France lies a region that has long been a magnet for mystery seekers, the Languedoc, known today for its vineyards and medieval castles. In the Middle Ages, it was a land of independent spirit, home to the Cathars, a Christian sect whose beliefs defied the authority of Rome. Official history tells of their persecution and eventual destruction in the 13th century, but another layer of legend suggests they were more than just religious descendants. Some believe the Cathars were guardians of ancient knowledge, possibly even protectors of the Meravenian bloodline. The Cathars rejected much of official church doctrine, favoring a simpler and more direct form of faith. They did not recognize the Pope's authority and embraced a dualistic worldview, seeing the material world as corrupt and the spiritual world as pure. This independence made them dangerous to the church, which accused them of heresy and sent armies to destroy them. But what if the threat was not just theological? What if the Cathars also possessed proof of a sacred lineage that contradicted the official story of Christendom? Strongholds like Montsegur, perched high on rocky peaks, were more than defensive fortresses. They were symbols of resistance and, according to legend, hiding places for treasures both physical and spiritual. In the final days before Montsegur fell in ER6, a small group of Cathars is said to have slipped away under the cover of darkness, carrying something of immense value. Some claim it was a sacred relic, others insist it was documents proving the bloodline's survival. The geography of the Languedoc made it an ideal refuge. Remote valleys and hidden paths connected isolated villages, allowing information and people to move discreetly. Pilgrims, merchants, and traveling troubadours could carry messages without attracting suspicion, weaving a network that stretched far beyond the region. It is possible that descendants of the Meravenians or their loyal elites found shelter here among the Cathars, blending into a community already accustomed to secrecy. Even after the Cathars were wiped out in the brutal Albigensian Crusade, the land kept its whispers. Folk tales passed down through generations spoke of secret vaults beneath ruined castles, coded carvings on stone lintels, and families claiming descent from both local nobility and a far older royal line. The church tried to erase the Cathars from history, but their story survived, stubbornly clinging to the hills and villages of the south. Today, visitors to the Languedoc can still feel the weight of its past. Standing on the windswept heights of Montsegur, looking out over the green valleys below, it is easy to imagine riders disappearing into the mist, something precious hidden in their saddlebags. Whether the Cathars truly guarded the Meravenian bloodline or not, the idea has taken root in the imagination, a reminder that in this land of stone and shadow, the past is never entirely gone, and some secrets are too important to die. The end for the Templars came swiftly, though the signs had been there for years. By the early 14th century, the Knights Templar were no longer untouchable. Their wealth, influence, and secrecy had earned them powerful enemies, none more dangerous than King Philip IV of France. Deeply in debt to the order and eager to break their power, the king found an ally in Pope Clement V. Together, they orchestrated one of the most infamous crackdowns in medieval history. On Friday, October 13, 1307, Templars across France were arrested in coordinated raids. They were accused of heresy, blasphemy, and other shocking crimes, charges most historians now believe were fabricated. Many were tortured into confessing whatever their captors demanded, and their assets were seized. The order once feared and respected was dissolved by papal decree. Yet even in this moment of destruction, the Templars' most closely guarded secrets, including any relics or documents tied to the Meravenian bloodline, may have slipped through the net. Legends tell of treasure convoys leaving Paris before the arrests began. Wagons loaded under cover of night and escorted by loyal knights to destinations unknown. Some accounts say they traveled to the coast, boarding ships from the port of La Rochelle, vessels that vanished into the Atlantic, perhaps bound for Scotland, Portugal, or even further afield. Wherever they went, they may have carried not just gold and silver, but items of immeasurable value: ancient scrolls, genealogical records, and relics linking the Meravenians to sacred history. Other Templars are believed to have fled inland, disappearing into sympathetic monasteries or retreating to remote strongholds in the Pyrenees. These locations, already steeped in legend, were ideal hiding places for both people and priceless artifacts. the church could hunt down individuals, but a hidden relic, especially one buried beneath layers of stone and sick could remain safe for generations. The trial and execution of Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Templars, became a symbol of the order's martyrdom. Burned at the stake in 1314, de Molay is said to have cursed both the king and the pope, predicting their deaths within the year a prophecy chroniclers claim came true. But Jacques de Molay's real legacy may not have been in words of vengeance, if the stories are true. His final act as leader was ensuring that the order's most important possessions escaped the grasp of its enemies. By the time the Templars were officially gone, their network had scattered across Europe. Some joined other orders, some assumed new identities, and some perhaps continued their mission in total secrecy. The relics they carried, if they existed, never resurfaced in public view. Instead, like the bloodline they may have sworn to protect, they passed quietly into legend, hidden in places where only the right hands would ever find them again. In the early 17th century, Europe was alive with new ideas. The Renaissance had sparked a hunger for knowledge that crossed the boundaries of science, art, and religion. It was in this climate that whispers began to circulate about a mysterious brotherhood calling itself the Rosicrucians, publicly revealed through a series of strange manifestos published in the German states around 1614. The order claimed devotion to spiritual enlightenment, scientific discovery, and the reformation of society. But to those who looked closely at its symbols and language, there seemed to be something more, an echo of an older, hidden tradition, one that some linked directly to the Meravenian bloodline. The Rosicrucian writings were filled with allegory and coded references. They spoke of a secret heritage preserved through centuries, passed from chosen guardians to those deemed worthy. Their emblem, a rose set upon a cross, was interpreted by many as a symbol of the union of spiritual and earthly authority. For those familiar with the history of the Meravenians, the image resonated deeply with themes of sacred kingship and divine lineage. The rose had long been connected to secrecy and hidden truths, while the cross carried obvious Christian significance. Together, they could be seen as a statement about a royal bloodline tied to holy origins. Some researchers have suggested that the Rosicrucians were not a new invention at all, but the latest public face of an older network of guardians, one that may have included the Templars and the Cathars before them. The Renaissance offered a safer environment to express such ideas. As intellectual curiosity was in vogue and ancient knowledge was being rediscovered through classical texts, still, the movement had to cloak its true aims in riddles and allegories to avoid drawing the wrath of the church. The Rosicrucian manifestos also spoke of journeys to the East and the preservation of secret wisdom gathered from ancient lands. This mirrors the legends of the Templars' expeditions to the Holy Land in search of relics and records. In some versions of the story, the Rosicrucians inherited materials from earlier custodians of the Meravenian legacy, preserving them in hidden archives and encoding their knowledge into art, literature, and architecture. By the mid-17th century, Rosicrucian influence could be traced in the works of philosophers, scientists, and alchemists, leaving an intellectual and mystical footprint that carried the echoes of a bloodline thought lost but never truly gone. Figures like Robert Fludd and Michael Mayer wove its symbols into their writings, hinting at truths that were never fully explained. Even the layout of certain gardens, buildings, and city plans began to reflect geometric designs with possible symbolic meaning tied to the order. Whether the Rosicrucians truly served as heirs to the Meravenian guardianship or simply borrowed their imagery, their revival of ancient symbols ensured that the legacy did not vanish. In an age of reason and discovery, they gave the old codes new life, carrying them forward to inspire the secret societies and esoteric movements that would emerge in the centuries to come. The bloodline story, hidden in plain sight, continued to whisper from behind the petals of the rose and the arms of the cross. When Napoleon Bonaparte crowned himself Emperor of the French in 1804, every detail of the ceremony was steeped in symbolism. The banners, the robes, the regalia, all chosen with care to project an image of legitimacy and destiny. Among the most curious of these choices was the appearance of golden bees, embroidered into fabrics, engraved into metal, and scattered throughout the imperial imagery of Paris. To most observers, they were simply a decorative motif, but to those who knew their history, the bees carried a far deeper meaning, one that reached back more than 1,000 years to the time of the Meravenian kings. The bee had been a royal emblem long before France existed. In the 5th century, Childeric I, a Meravenian king and father of Clovis, was buried with hundreds of tiny golden bee ornaments. These were discovered in his tomb in the 17th century, and scholars immediately recognized them as symbols of immortality, industry, and divine right to rule. By adopting the bee, Napoleon was aligning himself not just with France's more recent royal past, but with a dynasty that legend linked to sacred bloodlines and even biblical ancestry. Napoleon was a master of political theater. He understood that power was not only about armies and laws, but also about crafting a story that people would believe. France's monarchy had been overthrown during the Revolution, and the old Bourbon symbols like the fleur-de-lis were tainted by association. The bees, however, were older, purer, and carried no immediate connection to the despised recent kings. By reviving them, Napoleon could root his authority in an ancient tradition without appearing to simply restore the old order. The use of the bee was also a challenge to the church's control over the narrative of kingship. The Meravenians had been regarded as sacred rulers, their authority derived from both divine blessing and bloodline. By invoking that imagery, Napoleon hinted that his own claim to rule had a kind of inevitability, something beyond politics, something almost destined. Whether he truly believed in the Meravenian connection or simply exploited its mystique, the effect was the same. He wrapped himself in the aura of a lineage that carried whispers of holiness. In Paris, the bees appeared everywhere during his reign. They decorated official seals, imperial gowns, and even the upholstery in the palaces. Their presence was constant yet quiet, a reminder to those who recognized the symbol that Napoleon was more than just a soldier turned ruler. He was the inheritor of a tradition that predated the church's dominance and the rise of the Bourbons. When his empire fell, the bees faded from political life, but they never vanished entirely. Today, they can still be found in the decorative details of Parisian architecture and in the collections of museums, golden and delicate, carrying a story few pause to consider. For those who know the past, they remain more than ornaments. They are a sign that even in the modern age, the echoes of the Meravenian bloodline can find their way into the heart of power. In the quiet streets of European cities and the rolling countryside of old estates, there are families who carry names that rarely appear in history books, yet trace their ancestry back for centuries. Asterisk among them are those who claim, either openly or in guarded whispers, to be descendants of the Meravenian kings. To most people, the idea sounds like a plot from a novel, but for researchers and enthusiasts of the bloodline theory, these claims are worth examining. The Meravenians vanished from official history in the 8th century, replaced by the Carolingians with the blessing of the papacy. Yet the legends say the bloodline did not end, it went underground. Marriages into noble families, hidden identities, and careful alliances would have allowed the descendants to survive without attracting dangerous attention. Over time, their names changed, their titles shifted, and their story became a network of genealogies that only a few dedicated historians or insiders could trace. In modern Europe, some of these families live quiet lives, while others remain connected to positions of influence in politics, finance, or cultural institutions. Genealogists have pointed to links between the Meravenians and certain French, German, and Belgian noble lines. Theories even extend into the British aristocracy, suggesting that over centuries of the sacred bloodline spread far wider than anyone might imagine. One of the challenges in proving these claims lies in the fragmentary nature of early medieval records. Births, marriages, and deaths from the early Middle Ages were often poorly documented, and those that were recorded could have been altered or lost during wars, plagues, or political purges. This has left a gap that is easy to fill with speculation, which is why the subject remains both fascinating and controversial. Modern science has added a new layer to the discussion. Genetic research has made it possible to trace lineages through DNA testing, but without definitive ancient samples from known Meravenian remains. These studies can only suggest possibilities rather than prove them outright. Still, some researchers believe that rare genetic markers in certain European families could point to an origin in the royal Frankish houses of the early medieval period. The idea that the bloodline still exists today is more than just a curiosity. It carries implications for how we understand history and the nature of power. If a family could carry its influence, even quietly, for more than a millennium, it would challenge the assumption that revolutions, conquests, and political shifts truly erase the past. Instead, it would suggest that the past adapts, hiding in plain sight until the right moment to emerge again. For now, the descendants, if they are out there, seem content to remain in the shadows. Perhaps they see no advantage in revealing themselves, or perhaps they know that their story is too strange for the modern world to accept. But the whispers continue, passed among historians, conspiracy theorists, and storytellers alike, keeping alive the possibility that the bloodline of the Meravenians still walks among us, hidden in the everyday crowd. In the heart of modern France, glass towers rise beside centuries-old boulevards, and sleek museums stand where medieval markets once bustled. To the casual eye, these contemporary landmarks are works of engineering and design built for the needs of today. But to those who study symbolism, some of these structures appear to carry quiet nods to a past far older than the modern. Echoes of the Meravenian bloodline woven into the steel, stone, and glass of the 21st century. Paris, with its layered history, is the most obvious place to look. Certain architectural elements in recent public buildings seem almost deliberately patterned after Meravenian emblems. The bee, long associated with the dynasty, has been incorporated into decorative details on municipal buildings, subtly placed in mosaics or metal railings where few would notice without knowing what to look for. In some cases, it appears alongside the flag, a symbol more openly tied to French monarchy, but as historians point out, one that may have originated in Meravenian heraldry. Some of the most intriguing examples are found in the design of cultural institutions. The glass pyramid at the Louvre, for instance, has been analyzed by theorists for its geometric precision and placement in relation to older Parisian landmarks. While officially a work of modernist vision, some argue that its proportions reflect sacred geometry principles tied to ancient dynastic symbolism. Even newer structures, such as certain civic complexes and bridges, contain repeated patterns that mirror those seen in medieval abbeys connected to the Merovingian era outside of Paris. Small towns and regions once under Meravenian control have seen restorations and new constructions that incorporate similar motifs. A municipal building might feature carved stone bees in its entryway. A public garden could be laid out in a pattern resembling a cross enclosed within a circular. Designs some believe symbolize the union of heaven and earth in Meravenian thought. Often these details are subtle enough to pass as purely aesthetic choices, yet their recurrence suggests an intentional hand at work. Architects themselves are rarely open about such influences, which only adds to the intrigue. Some admit to drawing inspiration from French heritage without elaborating on which parts of that heritage they mean. Others claim coincidence when questioned about symbolic similarities. But the placement and consistency of these details make coincidence hard to believe. The possibility arises that certain designers, whether by personal belief or quiet commission, are ensuring that the memory of the bloodline is preserved in a language only a few can read. For the average passerby, these codes remain invisible, blending seamlessly into the cityscape. But for those who know the signs, modern France becomes a kind of open-air archive, its streets and buildings telling a story that stretches back to the shadowed halls of Merovingian courts. In glass, steel, and stone, the past continues to speak softly, patiently, and always just out of reach for those who do not know where to look. Deep within the Vatican lies a place few will ever see. Past guarded gates and long corridors, the apostolic archives stretch for miles beneath the city. The public knows it as a repository of history filled with manuscripts, letters, and ancient records. But among the countless documents locked away are said to be materials that directly concern the Merovingian dynasty, records, maps, and genealogies that could confirm or challenge centuries of belief about sacred bloodlines. The mystery is not just that these items exist, but that they remain hidden from view. The Vatican's relationship with the Merovingians has always been complicated. On one hand, these Frankish kings were among the first major rulers in Europe to embrace Christianity, helping to spread the faith across their territories. On the other hand, their claim to divine authority, possibly rooted in a bloodline connected to biblical figures, presented a challenge to the Church's own control over spiritual legitimacy. The papacy prefers to be the sole source of divine endorsement, and a royal house with a sacred claim independent of Rome could be a dangerous rival. For centuries, whispers have circulated that the Vatican holds original documents detailing the Merovingians' origins, their political dealings, and their possible connections to figures like Jesus and Mary Magdalene. These might include early church records, correspondence between bishops and Frankish rulers, or even suppressed gospels that support the idea of a sacred bloodline. If such materials exist, they could fundamentally alter the story of Christian history. That alone would explain why they are kept behind sealed doors. The question is, why keep them at all? If the Church truly wanted the bloodline forgotten, wouldn't it have destroyed the evidence long ago? Some believe the Vatican keeps these items not to erase them but to control them, ensuring that if the information ever needed to be revealed, it could be done on the Church's terms. Others suggest the materials hold knowledge that is not merely historical but theological, something so explosive it could cause a crisis of faith if mishandled. From time to time, researchers petition for access to the archives. While some are granted entry to study approved subjects, the process is slow and tightly monitored, and entire sections remain completely off. No one outside the highest ranks of the Church knows exactly what lies within those sealed rooms. The result is a growing fascination among historians, conspiracy theorists, and storytellers alike, imagining what truths might be hidden there until the Vatican chooses to open those vaults. The Merovingians will remain partly in the realm of legend, whether the silence is meant to protect the faithful, shield the Church's authority, or conceal an uncomfortable truth. It ensures that the story of the bloodline remains unresolved. And perhaps that is exactly what the Vatican wants, a mystery that can never be fully confirmed or denied, only whispered about in the shadows. The story begins in the mists of the early Middle Ages and stretches like a hidden thread through every century since. It went through the courts of kings and the halls of cathedrals, through the dusty records of monasteries and the quiet rooms of secret societies. It passes unseen across borders, slipping from one name to another, always moving forward, if the legends are to be believed. The Merovingian bloodline was never truly broken. It simply learned how to disappear in plain sight. History records their fall in the 8th century, when the Carolingians rose to power with the blessing of the papacy. But the whispers tell a different story, one of heirs who escaped the purge, aided by loyal allies who valued the bloodline's sacred heritage. From that moment, survival meant secrecy. Marriages were arranged not for love, but for strategic blending into other noble families. Children were given new names, far removed from the ancient ones that would have drawn dangerous attention through the centuries. The line is said to have surfaced quietly in moments of change, guiding events from behind the scenes. A patron funding a revolutionary thinker, a noble family influencing royal policy, a merchant dynasty shaping the economy of a rising city. These appearances were never enough to be obvious, but they formed a pattern visible to those who knew what to look for, even in the modern age. Some researchers claim that bloodline still plays a role in global affairs. The influence might not come through crowns and armies anymore, but through boardrooms, think tanks, and international institutions. The power is subtler now, less about ruling directly and more about ensuring that certain values, connections, and traditions endure. If this is true, it would mean the Meravenians adapted to a changing world without ever letting go of their original sense of destiny. Skeptics dismiss these ideas as romantic speculation, pointing out the lack of concrete proof, yet the absence of proof could be the strongest evidence of all. A family line that has survived more than a millennium of political upheaval would have mastered the art of leaving no trace. The very fact that the Meravenian name rarely appears in modern political life may be by design. Perhaps the truth lies in fragment symbols in architecture, recurring motifs in heraldry, the careful preservation of certain rituals. Or perhaps the truth is buried in archives that will never be opened, guarded by institutions that have every reason to keep it locked away. Either way, the idea persists, passed along in books, whispered in lecture halls, and debated late at night by those drawn to the possibility that history's most enduring dynasty never really vanished. And so the line continues, invisible yet present, moving like a shadow across the centuries. If the Meravenians still exist, they may be watching even now, their influence woven into decisions that shape nations. The story ends where it began, not with a coronation or a battle, but with a question: what if they never left?